In a busy neighborhood of the city, where cars honked and people rushed to their destinations, Officer Mark Thompson sat in his patrol car, scanning the streets. He was known for being strict, sometimes too strict, and had a reputation among his colleagues for not hiding his opinions about certain groups of people. Though he didn't openly admit it, many felt that Mark carried biases he couldn't or wouldn't shake off. On this particular afternoon, the sun blazed down on the ice, asphalt making the air shimmer with heat. Mark adjusted his sunglasses and sipped from a lukewarm coffee cup as he watched traffic flow past him. His radio crackled occasionally with updates from dispatch, but nothing urgent caught his attention. That's when he noticed a sleek black sedan zooming just slightly faster than the other vehicles around it. Mark squinted at the speedometer on his dashboard, estimating the car's speed. It wasn't wildly over the limit, maybe 5 or 6 miles per hour, but enough to give him a reason to pull it over. He turned on his lights and sirens, waiting for the driver to comply. The sedan slowed down smoothly before pulling over to the side of the road. When Mark approached the vehicle, he saw a woman sitting behind the wheel. She was dressed professionally, wearing a crisp blouse and her hair neatly styled. Her hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, and she glanced at him through the rearview mirror. There was no panic, no fumbling for documents, just quiet composure. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Mark said, his voice clipped. He tapped on the window, signaling for her to roll it down. When she did, he continued, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" The woman looked up at him, her expression calm but questioning. "I'm not sure," she replied politely. "Was I speeding?" "You were going 7 miles over the limit," Mark stated firmly, though he hadn't actually measured her speed yet. "License and registration, please." She nodded and reached into her bag without hesitation. As she handed him the requested items, Mark studied her face. Something about her demeanor irritated him. It wasn't fear or nervousness. Instead, it was an unshakable confidence that made him feel uneasy. "Thank you," he muttered, stepping back to examine her license. Her name was Andrea Carter. The address listed was in one of the nicer parts of town, which surprised him. People from that area usually drove more expensive cars and rarely got pulled over. Still, he decided to press further. "Ms. Carter, do you have any idea how dangerous it is to drive recklessly like that?" he asked, raising his voice slightly. Andrea blinked, taken aback by his tone. "Officer, I wasn't driving recklessly," she explained calmly. "If I was going a little fast, I apologize, but reckless, that seems excessive." Her response only fueled Mark's frustration. He hated being questioned, especially by someone who seemed so self-assured. "Excessive?" he snapped. 7 miles over isn't something to brush off. You're putting lives at risk. "I understand that," Andrea replied patiently. "But if we're talking about safety, shouldn't we also focus on things like distracted drivers or those running red lights? Speeding by a few miles doesn't compare to those dangers." Mark clenched his jaw. He didn't like her logic, nor did he appreciate her challenging him. In his mind, she was just another person trying to talk her way out of trouble. "Ma'am, arguing won't help your case," he said sharply. "Now stay here while I write up the ticket." As he walked back to his patrol car, Andrea sighed deeply. She knew interactions like these could escalate quickly, and she tried to remind herself to remain calm. But Mark's attitude was hard to ignore. Every word he spoke carried an undertone of disrespect, as if he'd already judged her based on something beyond her actions. A few minutes later, Mark returned, holding the ticket. Instead of handing it to her immediately, he leaned against her car door, invading her personal space. "You think you're above the rules because of where you live?" he sneered. "People like you always act like they're untouchable." Andrea frowned, feeling anger rise in her chest. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice firm now. "What does where I live have to do with anything? This is ridiculous." "This is about following the law," Mark shouted, his patience snapping. Before Andrea could respond, he grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her out of the car. "Get out of the vehicle." Shocked and outraged, Andrea struggled to free herself. "Let go of me," she demanded. "You're hurting me." But Mark didn't listen. For reasons even he couldn't fully explain, he shoved her against the side of the car, pinning her there briefly before letting go. Passers-by stopped to watch, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. Andrea stumbled backward, clutching her arm, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and fury. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Mark realized what he'd done and stepped back, his face pale. The crowd murmured angrily, and someone shouted, "That's unnecessary force." Another voice chimed in, "Leave her alone." Andrea straightened herself, her eyes blazing. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, but with conviction. Then, ignoring his attempts to regain control of the situation, she took the ticket from his hand and got back into her car. As she drove away, leaving Mark standing awkwardly by his patrol car, she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Unbeknownst to either of them, this encounter would set off a chain reaction neither could have predicted. For Mark, it would become a turning point in his career, and perhaps his life. And for Andrea, it would reveal truths about power, privilege, and justice that would change everything she thought she knew about fighting for change. By the time Andrea reached her office, her hands were still trembling, not from fear but from a mix of anger and disbelief. She replayed the incident in her mind, each detail sharper than the last. The way Mark had grabbed her arm, the dismissive tone in his voice, the way he'd treated her as if she were beneath him. All of it felt like pieces of a puzzle that revealed something much bigger than just one bad cop. Determined to take action, Andrea pulled out her phone and scrolled through the videos people had posted online. Sure enough, several bystanders had captured the altercation on their cameras. One video showed Mark shouting at her. Another zoomed in on the moment he shoved her against the car. The footage was clear, undeniable proof of what had happened. Andrea's stomach churned as she watched it again and again, feeling a surge of determination rise within her. She forwarded the clips to herself, then opened her laptop and drafted an email to the police department's Internal Affairs Division. In careful, measured words, she described the incident step by step, attaching both the videos and photos she'd taken of her bruised arm. She made sure to include every relevant detail, the license plate number of the patrol car, Mark's badge number visible on his uniform, even the names of some of the witnesses who had spoken up during the confrontation. As she hit send, Andrea leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. Filing a complaint wasn't easy. It required courage and resolve. But this wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly by someone like Mark. Still, she couldn't shake the nagging thought that filing a report might not be enough. Would they take her seriously? Or would Mark simply brush it off as a misunderstanding? Her worries began to fade when notifications started pouring in on her social media accounts. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers had seen the videos she shared earlier and were reaching out to express their support. Messages flooded her inbox. "You're so brave for speaking out. We're behind you 100%. This needs to stop." One message, however, stood out. It came from Sarah, a close friend and fellow advocate for law enforcement reform. "Andrea," Sarah wrote, "this is huge. We can use this moment to push for real change. Let me know how I can help." Encouraged by the overwhelming support, Andrea decided to share more publicly. She posted a detailed account of the incident on her professional LinkedIn profile, tagging local news outlets and community organizations. Within hours, the post went viral. Thousands of people commented, sharing their own stories of mistreatment by law enforcement. Some recounted similar experiences of being profiled or harassed based on their race, while others expressed outrage at the blatant misuse of authority. The media picked up the story quickly. Reporters called Andrea repeatedly, asking for interviews. At first, she hesitated. She didn't want to become the face of yet another controversy. But eventually, she agreed to speak with a few trusted journalists. During the interviews, Andrea remained composed, emphasizing that her goal wasn't revenge but accountability. "This isn't about targeting Officer Thompson personally," she explained during one televised segment. "It's about addressing systemic issues within our law enforcement system. No one should feel unsafe during a routine traffic stop, and no one should be subjected to unnecessary force because of prejudice." Meanwhile, Mark's world was unraveling. Back at the precinct, whispers spread among his colleagues after the video surfaced. Some officers avoided eye contact with him, while others muttered under their breath about how he'd messed up big time. His captain called him into the office, demanding an explanation. "Mark, what were you thinking?" the captain asked, slamming a printout of the viral video onto his desk. "You know better than to put your hands on someone unless absolutely necessary. This looks terrible, for you and for the department." Mark stammered, trying to defend himself. "Sir," she was resisting. She questioned my authority and refused. "To cooperate." "That's not what the video shows," the captain shot back. "It looks like you lost your temper. Internal Affairs is already investigating, and until this gets sorted out, you're suspended without pay." The weight of the situation crashed down on Mark. Suspended? How could this happen? He replayed the traffic stop in his mind, searching for excuses, rationalizations, anything to justify his actions. But deep down he knew he'd crossed a line. His frustration had gotten the better of him, and now there was no going back. At home, Mark tried to explain things to his wife, Lisa, but she was furious. "How could you do this, Mark?" she demanded, pacing the living room. "You've always had strong opinions, but this is unacceptable. Do you realize how much trouble you're in?" "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Mark mumbled, sinking into the couch. "I was just doing my job." "No, you weren't," Lisa snapped. "You let your biases get in the way, and now we're paying the price. What happens if they fire you? What happens if they press charges?" Mark didn't have answers. For the first time in years, he felt completely powerless. As the days passed, the stress mounted. He stopped answering calls from friends and family, ashamed of the attention the incident had brought. Every knock at the door made him jump, fearing it might be reporters or investigators coming to confront him. While Mark spiraled into despair, Andrea continued to channel her energy into advocacy. She met with representatives from civil rights groups, discussing ways to hold law enforcement accountable for misconduct. She also spoke at a city council meeting, urging officials to implement stricter policies regarding excessive force and racial profiling. But it wasn't until a surprising revelation came to light that the stakes truly shifted. One evening, as Andrea reviewed documents related to upcoming oversight initiatives, she stumbled upon a name that caught her eye: Officer Mark Thompson. Attached to his file was a note indicating that he was assigned to the very precinct she oversaw, as part of her role as a senior advisor for the city's Law Enforcement Reform Committee. For a moment, Andrea sat frozen, staring at the screen. This wasn't just a random officer who had wronged her, it was someone working directly under her jurisdiction. The realization sent a chill down her spine. If she had known sooner, would she have handled things differently? Probably not, she decided. But now the situation carried even greater significance. With renewed purpose, Andrea prepared for the next phase of the battle. She contacted the police commissioner, providing updates on the case and offering recommendations for disciplinary action. She also pushed for transparency, ensuring that the public stayed informed about the investigation's progress. As the weeks dragged on, tension simmered between Andrea's quest for justice and Mark's desperate attempts to salvage his career. Neither of them realized yet how intertwined their paths would become, or how profoundly this incident would reshape their lives forever. The weeks following the incident were a whirlwind for both Andrea and Mark, but in very different ways. For Andrea, life had become a balancing act between her professional responsibilities, her advocacy work, and the growing public spotlight on her case. Every day brought new developments: interview requests, updates from Internal Affairs, and messages of support from people all over the country. Despite the chaos, she remained focused, determined to see this through to the end. For Mark, however, the days felt like an endless descent into uncertainty. Suspended without pay, he spent most of his time alone in his house, glued to the news or scrolling through social media, dreading what he might find. The backlash was relentless. Online forums lit up with discussions about his behavior, some calling for his immediate termination, others labeling him as the poster child for systemic racism in policing. Even his neighbors began treating him differently, avoiding eye contact or crossing the street to steer clear of him. One morning, Mark received a summons to attend a mandatory meeting at the precinct. It wasn't unusual for officers under investigation to be required to participate in departmental discussions, but this particular meeting carried extra weight. The topic? Policy changes being implemented under the guidance of the city's newly formed Oversight Committee, a group tasked with reviewing police conduct and recommending reforms. Mark groaned as he read the email. He hated these meetings. They always felt like lectures disguised as collaboration, with higher-ups preaching about community relations and implicit bias. Still, he couldn't afford to skip it. Attendance was mandatory, and any absence would only make him look worse. On the day of the meeting, Mark arrived late, slipping quietly into the back row of the conference room. The space was filled with officers, administrators, and a few unfamiliar faces sitting at the front table. One of them stood out immediately, a woman dressed in a tailored navy blazer, her posture confident, her expression calm, yet piercing. As she introduced herself, Mark's stomach dropped. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady and commanding. "My name is Andrea Carter, and I serve as a senior advisor for the Oversight Committee. Many of you may already know me, but for those who don't, my role is to help bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities we serve." Mark froze, his mind racing. Andrea Carter. The name echoed in his head. No, it couldn't be. But as she continued speaking, there was no mistaking her. She was the same woman he'd pulled over, the same woman whose arm he'd grabbed, the same woman whose video had gone viral. And now here she was, standing before him, leading a discussion that could shape the future of policing in the city, and possibly determine his fate. As Andrea spoke, outlining the goals of the Oversight Committee and sharing statistics about public trust in law enforcement, Mark struggled to keep his composure. His palms grew sweaty, and his heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to leave, to disappear, but he forced himself to stay seated, hoping to blend into the background. When the floor opened for questions, Andrea addressed each one thoughtfully, engaging with the audience in a way that exuded authority and empathy. Finally, she turned to the group and said, "Before we wrap up, I want to share a personal story. Recently, I experienced firsthand the kind of misconduct we're trying to prevent. Some of you may have seen the video online. It involved an officer from this very precinct." The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward Andrea, and then inevitably toward Mark. He felt the weight of their stares pressing down on him, suffocating. Andrea didn't point fingers or raise her voice. Instead, she maintained her calm demeanor as she continued. "That officer is here today," she said, looking directly at Mark. "I'm not mentioning this to shame him or seek revenge. I'm bringing it up because it highlights exactly why our work is so important. What happened to me isn't unique. Countless individuals have faced similar treatment, often without the privilege of having their voices heard. That's why we need accountability, transparency, and meaningful change." Mark couldn't breathe. He stared at the table in front of him, unable to meet Andrea's gaze. The irony of the situation hit him like a freight train. Of all the people in the city, of all the advisors and consultants they could have chosen, she was the one overseeing policy changes that would affect officers like him. After the meeting ended, Mark lingered in the hallway, unsure of what to do next. Part of him wanted to march up to Andrea and apologize, to explain that he hadn't meant to hurt her, that he was just having a bad day. But another part of him, the stubborn, prideful part, told him to stay quiet, to avoid drawing more attention to himself. To his surprise, Andrea approached him first. She walked over with measured steps, stopping just a few feet away. Her expression was unreadable, neither angry nor sympathetic. "Officer Thompson," she said evenly, "we need to talk." Mark swallowed hard, nodding stiffly. "Yes, ma'am." They stepped into a nearby office, closing the door behind them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Andrea broke the silence. "I'm not going to pretend this isn't awkward," she admitted, folding her arms across her chest. But I think it's important we address this directly. You've seen the video. You know what happened. So tell me, why did you react the way you did? Mark hesitated, searching for the right words. I don't know, he stammered. I guess I let my emotions get the better of me. I shouldn't have touched you. I realize that now. Andrea studied him carefully, her expression softening slightly. Do you understand why your actions were wrong? Yes, Mark replied quickly, though his tone lacked conviction. It was unprofessional. I lost control. It was more than that, Andrea corrected gently but firmly. You profiled me. You judged me based on assumptions rather than facts. That's not just unprofessional, it's harmful. People like me, people of color, deal with that kind of treatment every single day. We're tired of it. And if we're going to fix this system, we need officers who are willing to acknowledge their biases and work to overcome them. Her words struck a chord deep within Mark. He'd always prided himself on being fair, on treating everyone equally. But hearing Andrea describe his actions made him question whether he truly believed his own rhetoric. Was he really as impartial as he claimed? Or had years of ingrained prejudices clouded his judgment? I'm sorry, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I never meant to hurt anyone, I don't know how to fix this. Andrea sighed, leaning against the desk. Apologizing is a start, but it's not enough. If you genuinely want to make amends, you'll have to put in the work, attend the training sessions, listen to feedback, reflect on your behavior and commit to changing it. Otherwise, nothing will improve. For you, for me, or for anyone else affected by this system. Mark nodded slowly, feeling a mix of shame and determination. He didn't know if he could undo the damage he'd caused, but he realized he had, no choice but to try. Sitting there, face to face with the woman he'd wronged, he understood for the first time the true impact of his actions, not just on Andrea, but on the countless lives touched by officers like him. As they left the office, together Andrea extended her hand. This doesn't erase what happened, she said, but it's a step forward. Let's hope it leads somewhere meaningful. Mark shook her hand, his grip firm but tentative. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. Not for redemption, necessarily, but for the possibility of growth. Little did he know this encounter would mark the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and the world around him. In the days following their private conversation, Mark found himself grappling with a mix of emotions: guilt, shame, and an overwhelming sense of dread. He couldn't shake the image of Andrea's calm yet piercing gaze as she spoke to him in that office. Her words echoed in his mind. You profiled me. You judged me based on assumptions rather than facts. It was a truth he hadn't wanted to confront, but now it lingered like a shadow, haunting every thought. Mark knew he had two choices: double down on denial, or face the reality of his actions. For years, he justified his behavior by telling himself he was just doing his job, enforcing the law, keeping people safe. But Andrea's clarity forced him to see the cracks in that narrative. Maybe he wasn't the upstanding officer he'd always believed himself to be. Maybe he was part of the problem. Meanwhile, Andrea continued her advocacy work with renewed focus. The incident had brought widespread attention to the issue of police misconduct, and she seized the opportunity to push for systemic change. She collaborated with city officials, community leaders, and civil rights organizations to draft stricter accountability measures for law enforcement officers. One of her key proposals included mandatory bias training programs, a suggestion that sparked heated debates within the department. When the final hearing for Mark's case arrived, the atmosphere was tense. Held in a small conference room at the precinct, the meeting was attended by senior officers, representatives from Internal Affairs, and members of the Oversight Committee, including Andrea. Mark sat at the center of the table, flanked by his union representative, his hands clasped tightly together. His heart raced as each person took turns speaking. The head of Internal Affairs began by summarizing the findings of their investigation. Based on the evidence presented, including body cam footage and witness statements, Officer Thompson's use of force during the traffic stop was deemed excessive and unwarranted, he announced. This is a serious violation of department policy. Mark winced, bracing himself for what came next. The consequences would likely include termination and possibly criminal charges. As the discussion shifted to potential disciplinary actions, Andrea stood up to address the group. "I understand the gravity of this situation," she began, her voice steady and measured. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It's symptomatic of larger issues within our system. However, I also believe in second chances when paired with accountability. Terminating Officer Thompson's career may satisfy some calls for justice, but it won't address the root causes of his behavior." Her statement surprised everyone in the room, including Mark. She went on to propose an alternative. Instead of immediate dismissal, Mark could enroll in a rigorous rehabilitation program designed to address implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and community engagement. If he successfully completed the program, he would be allowed to return to duty under strict probationary terms. "This isn't about letting him off the hook," Andrea clarified. "It's about giving him, and others like him, an opportunity to learn and grow. Real change happens when we challenge harmful attitudes and behaviors, not when we simply remove individuals from the equation." The room erupted into murmurs. Some officers nodded in agreement while others exchanged skeptical glances. The idea of offering leniency to someone who had acted so egregiously was controversial, to say the least. But after a lengthy deliberation, the panel agreed to Andrea's proposal, albeit reluctantly. For Mark, the decision felt like both a lifeline and a daunting challenge. On one hand, he avoided losing his job outright. On the other, the road ahead promised to be grueling. The rehabilitation program required months of intensive training, weekly counseling sessions, and regular evaluations. Failure to meet any of the program's standards would result in automatic termination. As the hearing concluded, Andrea approached Mark once more. "This is your chance to prove you're capable of change," she told him. "Don't waste it." Mark nodded, unable to find the words to express how deeply her gesture affected him. For the first time since the incident, he felt a sliver of hope. Not because he thought redemption would come easily, but because someone had chosen to believe in the possibility of transformation. Over the following weeks, Mark threw himself into the rehabilitation program with a determination he hadn't felt in years. Each day began with workshops led by experts in psychology, sociology, and conflict resolution. Topics ranged from understanding implicit bias to recognizing microaggressions and building empathy. At first, Mark struggled to engage. The concepts felt foreign, even uncomfortable, forcing him to confront parts of himself he'd long ignored. One particularly challenging session focused on personal accountability. Participants were asked to reflect on moments in their lives when they had wronged someone and consider how those actions might have been influenced by societal conditioning. When it was Mark's turn to share, he hesitated, his throat tightening. Finally, he spoke haltingly about the traffic stop with Andrea. "I didn't realize until later how much my own biases shaped my reaction," he admitted. "I thought I was being tough and forcing the rules, but really I was acting out of fear and ignorance. I let my assumptions define her before I even knew her name." The facilitator nodded encouragingly. "Acknowledging that is a big step. Now think about what you can do differently moving forward." Mark spent hours reflecting on that question, journaling late into the night. Slowly, he began to piece together a new perspective, one that prioritized listening over assuming, compassion over control. Counseling sessions helped him unpack deeper layers of his personality, revealing insecurities and prejudices he hadn't fully understood before. Despite the progress, the journey wasn't easy. Some colleagues mocked him behind his back, accusing him of going soft or caving to political correctness. Others refused to acknowledge the need for reform altogether, dismissing the program as unnecessary. Mark often felt isolated, caught between his old identity and the person he hoped to become. But there were moments of encouragement too. During one workshop, he partnered with a fellow officer named Rachel, who had enrolled in the program voluntarily, after realizing she needed to improve her approach to policing. Together, they practiced de-escalation techniques, role-playing scenarios where they learned to defuse tension without resorting to force. Rachel's openness inspired Mark to keep pushing forward, even when doubt crept in. Outside the program, Andrea kept tabs on Mark's progress, occasionally checking in with the facilitators to ensure he remained committed. Though she maintained a professional distance, she couldn't deny feeling a sense of cautious optimism. Watching Mark wrestle with his flaws reminded her of why she'd advocated for this path in the first place. Change was possible, but only if people were willing to embrace discomfort and vulnerability. By the end of the program, Mark had transformed in ways he never imagined. He no longer saw himself as infallible or above reproach. Instead, he viewed his role as a police officer through a lens of humility and responsibility. Graduation day arrived, and as he stood alongside his peers, receiving certificates of completion, he caught Andrea's eye across the room. She gave him a small, approving nod, a silent acknowledgement of the effort he'd put in. Though the hardest part of his journey still lay ahead, rebuilding trust with the community and proving himself worthy of wearing the badge again, Mark felt ready to face it. For the first time in a long time, he believed he could make a difference, not just for himself, but for others too. And Andrea, watching from afar, allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. Perhaps, she thought, this could be the beginning of something bigger, a ripple effect of growth and healing that extended far beyond one man's mistakes. After completing the rehabilitation program, Mark returned to active duty, but not in the way he had imagined. Instead of patrolling the streets or handling high-profile cases, he was assigned to community outreach programs. These initiatives aimed to rebuild trust between law enforcement and marginalized groups, particularly those who had historically felt alienated by the system. For Mark, this new role felt like both a punishment and an opportunity, a chance to prove himself, but also a constant reminder of his past mistakes. The first few weeks were awkward. Mark attended neighborhood meetings, school assemblies, and local events, introducing himself as Officer Thompson. At first, people were hesitant to engage with him. Some avoided eye contact altogether, while others openly expressed their distrust. During one meeting at a community center, a young woman stood up and said bluntly, "How do we know you're not just pretending to care? What's stopping you from going back to your old ways?" Mark swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. He wanted to defend himself, to explain how much he'd changed, but he knew that wouldn't be enough. Actions spoke louder than words, and he hadn't earned the right to ask for anyone's trust yet. So instead, he simply nodded and replied, "You're absolutely right. I can't expect you to believe me based on promises alone. All I can do is show up, listen, and try to make things better. That's why I'm here." His honesty seemed to catch the audience off guard. A few people exchanged glances, while others leaned forward slightly, intrigued. Though skepticism lingered, Mark could sense a small shift, a crack in the wall of mistrust. Over time, he began to find his footing. One of his assignments involved working closely with a youth mentorship program, where officers partnered with teenagers to discuss topics like conflict resolution, leadership, and civic responsibility. Initially, the teens treated him with suspicion, rolling their eyes or muttering sarcastic remarks whenever he spoke. But Mark didn't let it discourage him. He showed up consistently, participated in activities, and listened without interrupting. Slowly, they started opening up to him. One afternoon, during a basketball game organized as part of the program, Mark found himself paired with a 16-year-old named Jamal. The two played poorly together at first, their lack of chemistry evident in missed passes and clumsy footwork. But after a while, Jamal cracked a joke about Mark's rusty skills, and they both burst into laughter. By the end of the game, they were high-fiving and teasing each other like old friends. Later, as they sat on the bleachers drinking water, Jamal asked casually, "So, what made you decide to start doing this stuff? Like helping kids and all?" "That?" Mark hesitated, unsure how much to share. Finally, he said, "Honestly, I got into some trouble a while back. I messed up pretty badly, and it made me realize I needed to change, not just for my sake, but for everyone else's too." This job isn't just about catching bad guys. It's about making sure people feel safe and respected. And if I can help, even one person see cops differently, then maybe I'll have done something worthwhile. Jamal studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. That's cool, man. Just don't mess up again, all right? Mark smiled faintly. I won't. I promise. While Mark worked to rebuild bridges within the community, Andrea continued advocating for broader systemic changes. She spearheaded campaigns to increase funding for de-escalation training, pushed for greater transparency in disciplinary actions, and lobbied city officials to implement body cameras across all departments. Her efforts earned widespread praise, but they also drew criticism from those resistant to reform. At a town hall meeting, a veteran officer stood up and accused Andrea of undermining police morale. We're out there risking our lives every day, he argued, and all we hear is how terrible we are. You talk about accountability, but what about supporting us when we're doing our jobs right? Andrea listened patiently before responding. I understand your concerns, and I agree that good officers deserve recognition and support. But accountability and appreciation aren't mutually exclusive. Holding individuals accountable for misconduct doesn't mean dismissing the hard work of others. In fact, addressing these issues strengthens public trust, which ultimately benefits everyone, including you. Her balanced response disarmed the critic, earning applause from the crowd. Still, Andrea knew the fight for reform would require patience and persistence. Changing deeply ingrained systems took time, and resistance was inevitable. Despite their different roles, Andrea and Mark occasionally crossed paths during community events. Their interactions remained professional, though there was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared acknowledgement of the progress being made, however incremental. Andrea noticed subtle changes in Mark's demeanor. He carried himself with more humility, listened intently during discussions, and actively sought feedback from residents. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One evening, after a panel discussion on policing reform, Andrea approached Mark privately. How's it going? She asked, her tone neutral but curious. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's challenging. There are days when I feel like I'm making headway, and then there are moments when I wonder if anything will ever really change. But I keep reminding myself why I'm doing this. If I can help even one person feel safer around cops, it's worth it. Andrea nodded thoughtfully. That's the right mindset. Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step counts. Keep going. Her encouragement meant more to Mark than he cared to admit. Though their relationship would never be entirely free of tension, he appreciated her willingness to guide him, even indirectly, toward becoming a better version of himself. As the months passed, Mark's reputation within the department began to shift. While some colleagues still viewed him with disdain, others admired his resilience and dedication. His superiors noted improvements in his performance reviews, praising his ability to connect with diverse communities and handle sensitive situations with care. Meanwhile, Andrea's influence expanded beyond the city limits. News outlets highlighted her success stories, portraying her as a beacon of hope in the ongoing struggle for justice. She received invitations to speak at national conferences, collaborate with policymakers, and advise other cities on implementing similar reforms. Yet, despite their individual achievements, neither Andrea nor Mark forgot the incident that had brought them together. For Andrea, it served as a reminder of the power dynamics at play in society and the importance of holding authority figures accountable. For Mark, it symbolized a turning point in his life, a moment when he'd been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and his profession. By the end of the year, Mark had become a familiar face in neighborhoods once hostile to law enforcement. Parents thanked him for mentoring their children, and students greeted him warmly in the hallways. One day, as he walked through a park filled with families enjoying a sunny afternoon, a little girl ran up to him and handed him a drawing she'd made. It depicted a smiling police officer surrounded by happy kids with the words, "Thank you," scrawled across the top. Mark knelt down to thank her, his throat tightening with emotion. As he watched her skip back to her mother, He realized how far he'd come since that fateful traffic stop. He wasn't the same man anymore, and for the first time in years, he felt proud of the person he was becoming. Though challenges remained, Mark and Andrea had each taken significant steps toward creating a more equitable and compassionate world. Together, albeit indirectly, they proved that accountability and growth could coexist, that even in moments of conflict, redemption and reconciliation were possible. Months turned into a year, and the ripple effects of Andrea's advocacy and Mark's transformation continued to spread. What had started as a single incident, a moment of conflict on a busy street, had evolved into something much larger, a story of accountability, growth, and unlikely collaboration. For both Andrea and Mark, this journey wasn't just about personal redemption. It was about proving that meaningful change was possible when people were willing to confront their flaws and work toward a better future. Mark's role in community outreach became more than just a job. It became his purpose. He no longer saw himself as an enforcer of rules, but as a bridge builder, someone who could help mend the fractured relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served. His days were filled with meetings, workshops, and one-on-one conversations with residents. He listened intently to their concerns, shared stories of his own struggles, and worked alongside them on projects aimed at fostering trust. One such project involved organizing a neighborhood cleanup initiative. Mark partnered with local leaders to bring together volunteers from all walks of life, young and old, black and white, civilian and officer, to revitalize a park that had fallen into disrepair. On the day of the event, dozens of people showed up armed with gloves, trash bags, and paintbrushes. As they worked side by side, laughter replaced tension, and conversations flowed freely. By the end of the day, the park looked vibrant and welcoming, a testament to what could be achieved when people came together. For Mark, these moments were priceless. They reminded him why he'd chosen to stay in law enforcement despite everything he'd been through. "This is what policing should be about," he told Andrea during one of their rare check-ins. "Not fear or force, but connection and service." Andrea nodded, smiling faintly. "Exactly. And you're showing others that it's possible." Her words carried weight, not just for Mark, but for the entire department. Officers who had once dismissed Mark's efforts began to take notice. Some even joined him in community programs, inspired by the positive feedback they received. The culture within the precinct slowly shifted, with more emphasis placed on empathy and accountability. It wasn't perfect. There were still setbacks and resistance, but progress was undeniable. Meanwhile, Andrea's influence reached new heights. She traveled across the country, sharing her experiences and advocating for systemic reforms. Her speeches resonated deeply with audiences, blending personal anecdotes with data-driven insights. At a national conference on criminal justice reform, she stood before a packed auditorium and recounted the story of her encounter with Mark, not to shame him, but to highlight the potential for transformation. "Change begins with accountability," she said, her voice steady and impassioned. "But it doesn't end there. Real progress requires effort from everyone involved, from those who hold power to those who challenge it. We must create spaces where difficult conversations can happen, where mistakes are acknowledged, and where growth is celebrated. That's how we move forward." The audience erupted into applause, many rising to their feet. Among them was Mark, who had quietly attended the conference to support Andrea. As he watched her speak, he felt a surge of pride, not just for her accomplishments, but for the part he'd played in demonstrating that redemption was possible. Though their paths had diverged professionally, their shared history remained a powerful reminder of what could be achieved when people committed to doing better. Back home, Mark faced new challenges. Despite his efforts, not everyone forgave him for his past actions. Some residents continued to view him with suspicion, while others outright refused to engage with him. During a town hall meeting, an elderly woman stood up and confronted him directly. "How do I know you won't hurt someone else?" she demanded, her voice trembling with emotion. Mark took a deep breath, meeting her gaze without flinching. "You don't," he admitted honestly. "All I can offer is my word, that I've learned from my mistakes and am working every day to be better. Trust isn't given, it's earned. and if you ever see me slipping, I hope you'll call me out on it." His vulnerability disarmed the room, earning murmurs of approval. The woman didn't soften immediately, but she nodded slightly, acknowledging his sincerity. It was a small victory, but one that mattered deeply to Mark. As time went on, Andrea and Mark occasionally collaborated on initiatives aimed at improving police-community relations. They co-hosted workshops, facilitated dialogues, and mentored younger officers eager to learn from their experiences. Their partnership, though rooted in an unlikely beginning, became a symbol of hope for others navigating similar conflicts. 1. Evening after wrapping up a successful workshop, Andrea and Mark found themselves alone in the conference room, packing up materials. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost companionable. For a moment neither spoke, content to let the quiet settle around them. Finally, Andrea broke the silence. "You've come a long way," she said, glancing at him with a hint of admiration. "I'm proud of the work you're doing." Mark hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Thank you. I couldn't have done it without your guidance, even if it wasn't always direct." Andrea chuckled softly. "Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones we need most." They shared a brief laugh, the kind born of mutual understanding and respect. Though their journey had been fraught with difficulty, it had also brought unexpected rewards: growth, forgiveness, and a renewed sense of purpose. As they left the building together, the sun casting long shadows across the parking lot, Andrea paused and turned to Mark. "You know, this isn't the end. There's still so much work to be done for both of us. But if we keep pushing forward, maybe we can inspire others to do the same." Mark nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "Agreed, one step at a time." With that, they parted ways, each heading back to their respective roles in the ongoing fight for justice. Though their paths would continue to intersect occasionally, they both knew their individual missions were far from over. Together they had proven that accountability and growth weren't mutually exclusive, that even in moments of conflict, reconciliation was possible. In the years that followed, their story became a beacon of hope for communities grappling with similar issues. It served as a reminder that change, however daunting, was achievable when people chose courage over complacency, humility over defensiveness, and action over apathy. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, Andrea and Mark walked it with unwavering resolve, knowing they had already made a difference. One step, one conversation, one transformed life at a time.